Welcome into Buccaneers Insider Live, presented by Miller Lite. Casey Phillips and Scott Smith here, and this is where, as always, we answer your questions, talk about all of the thoughts, comments, things that are on your mind, especially this time of year when it is all the speculation. This is when the show is really based on a lot of y'all's questions and what you want to talk about. So if you're not already watching on Facebook, head on over there, leave your questions in the comment section of our live video.
Tell us where you're from.
Yeah, tell us where you're from. We always love hearing that and where people are watching from. So as we give people a chance to start submitting some of those questions, two things, sort of developments since our last show. One is that we know Drew Brees is going to return with the Saints, and the other is that we actually got to hear from Bruce Arians this last week after, once the season ends, usually there's a kind of prolonged period of no access to those guys. So let's start with Bruce. What were some of the things you guys talked to him about and any insights or things that came from
In fact,
it?
I'm not sure I'd label that as a development because it was basically the opposite of a development. It's funny in this period when something like this happens and the general public probably thinks, Bruce decided to come out and say something about these topics for the first time in like 6 weeks. Well, it wasn't really that. What happens is your coach, your GM just happens to be available at some event and the media is aware of it and they're doing their jobs and they go there, and if they get a chance to talk to them, they ask the questions they haven't got to ask in 6 weeks. So they did, but as it turns out, most of what Bruce said was the exact same thing he said 6 weeks ago. And he said nothing's really changed.
Right.
And he repeated one of the lines he said back then, which gets a lot of play, and that's basically, to paraphrase, what's behind door number 2, and that's in reference to what are the Buccaneers going to do, what do they want to do with quarterback Jameis Winston, and what's behind door number 2 means what other options are out there. And it is important to know that. I don't think anybody would think a team was doing their due diligence on deciding what direction to go with their potential franchise quarterback or some other if they don't have a good comparison. It's not necessarily a slight to Jameis or a vote for Jameis. It's the thing that a team should do. And until you know for sure who's going to be available and until you get to talk to some of them, you can't really put all the pieces together.
Yeah.
So we know now, like you said, that Drew Brees is not going to be available. Not that anybody thought he was coming here, but does the fact that Drew Brees is definitely coming back mean Teddy Bridgewater is more likely to be, as an example? So I would think so, right?
Yeah, and I think that seems to be the assumption. The way everyone's talking about it is just that he is definitely not coming back. That Bridgewater will move on. That he does not want to be.
Right?
Yeah,
I mean, he made $7.5 million, I think, to be a backup last year. But you look at projections. What if some team wants to pay him $25 million to be their starter?
Right.
He's
Something
obviously
tells me he's
leave.
going to take that. Yeah. And especially when the Saints still have Taysom Hill.
Right.
It's not like they're all of a sudden like, oh man, we don't have a backup. That they view him as a very viable backup. So.
And he's a restricted free agent, so they have a pretty good chance of keeping him.
Right, which is a great point. We've got a lot of people chiming in with where they're listening and watching from, which is cool. We got Kansas City. Okay. We've got Puerto Rico.
So a Bucs fan in Kansas City right now?
I guess so. Yeah, that's probably got to be pretty miserable having to watch all of that. Puerto Rico, we've got Georgia, Kentucky, North Carolina, Texas, a whole bunch of really fun places, which is awesome.
Of course, you could just make it up.
That's also true. We've definitely had people do that in the past, considering somebody, I think, at one point said Antarctica. Pretty sure that wasn't true.
Whoville.
Yes. Nathan asked, do you think we could get Bridgewater? So as we were discussing that with the... Yeah, sure. Sure.
Well, I mean, seriously, though, when you start... And that's... if you're going to answer that question, you're making the presumption that the Bucs are not going to resign Jameis, right? So how many teams are going to be looking for a quarterback and are going to be in the business of paying, in the position to pay somebody, a veteran moving teams, $20, $25 million. There's not a ton of them, really, when you look at it. So if Teddy Bridgewater is looking for a place to start, and if it becomes clear that the Buccaneers are not going to continue forward with Jameis, then I would think this would become one of the top destinations that these quarterbacks would be looking at, especially when you consider who you're going to get to throw the ball to, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I would think any quarterback would want to come here and throw to Mike and Chris and OJ and Cam.
Yeah, I can't imagine any quarterback being like, no, that doesn't sound fun. Austin asked, is it possible to afford Shaq and trade for Jamal Adams? I think that would really put the defense over the top. What are your thoughts? He said, also, I'm from Martinsburg, West Virginia, only fan around.
So we get to re-sign Shaq, but we also get to trade for one of the best safeties in the league. That'd be great. Yeah, it's possible to afford it. You're probably making a priority decision there, though, because it's probably not possible to do that and get Jamal Adams and bring back all the other potential defensive free agents like Ndamukong Suh and Jason Pierre-Paul. And I know Bruce Arians would definitely like to have all those players back if he could. And in any case, are the Jets really going to trade Jamal Adams? I mean, are we just going to start picking guys out that?
Yeah, we forget that there has to be the other half of where they have to be willing to get rid of this person,
Yeah.
and that's probably not something they want to do.
Well, I mean, there was some talk about that during the season, which is why somebody would bring that up. But I would suspect he stays put.
It's like with anything with trades, it's always easy to just talk about like our end of it, of what we'd want to do, and same thing even with the draft of, can we trade down? It's like, well, yeah, you got to have someone that's willing to do the other part.
But I mean, let's go ahead and re-sign Shaq and trade for Jamal Adams. Maybe we can get J.J. Watt while we're at it.
Yeah, I like all these
work out
plans.
pretty
This
well.
is great.
Yeah. I like how it's coming together.
Yeah. Sean asked, will we draft a running back this year?
I'd say there's a good shot. I would be surprised if it's in the first round. I think we've talked about this a lot. With some exceptions in recent years, like just the guys that are expected to be really elite workhorses like Ezekiel Elliott and Leonard Fournette, the running backs aren't going as high as they used to, right? Because they're considered assets you can get, like Alvin Kamara in the third round, guys like that, right? And so teams go into it thinking, we can use our first round pick on something else because we do think there's a good chance of getting one in the second or the third round. But yeah, that seems like something the Bucs could definitely do with one of their day 2 or 3 picks. Sure.
Scott said he's watching from New Mexico.
Good name.
And he asked, isn't Phillip Rivers just an older Jameis? So as a lot of people have asked about Phillip Rivers and how he would fit here and whether you'd want him over Jameis.
I get it. Everybody's saying the same thing because I guess Phillip Rivers had the third most interceptions in the league with 20. But they're not the same player. I mean, everybody, since we got Jameis, wanted to say that Jameis was just a younger Ben Roethlisberger.
Right.
But they're not really the same player. I get the point, though. I think the point is, if you're moving on from Jameis Winston, it's not because he threw for 5,100 yards and 30 touchdowns. It's because of all the turnovers, right? And if you're moving on, do you then want to sign a new quarterback, but an older one who's probably beyond his peak, who also last year turned the ball over a lot? So I understand, but they're not the same guy.
Yeah. Sean asked, what is taking so long to sign Shaq, Sue, or JPP? So let's talk about overall just the timeline of some of that stuff.
We've talked about this a couple times. Just to be sure I was right about this, I went back and looked at our transaction logs from like the last 10 years. And there's always a couple guys you're trying to re-sign before the start of free agency, right? Almost every one of those happened in March, and most of them were really close to the start of free agency, and some of them were even on the day of or a couple days after. And in the case of, say, Shaq, you potentially could use the franchise tag and extend those negotiations for weeks after the start of free agency. And so you've got two sides here that are trying to meet in a middle ground that works for both. And as he absolutely should, Shaq is going to try to get as much in his contract as he can. And the Bucs, as they absolutely should, are going to try to make it as affordable for them as they can. And so it takes a while. You're not going to. Shaq's just not going to take the first deal the Bucs put on the table or the first number they throw out there, and probably vice versa. So these things tend to be driven by deadlines, is the way I would put it. So that's why we're not hearing anything. If you look back at all these types of transactions, you're not going to find a single one on, what's today, December 18th, 19th? You're not going to find one.
February, yeah. I was like, you're definitely not going to find them December.
Yeah, exactly.
Chauncey.
6 shopping days till Christmas.
Yes. Better get out there and hurry. Chauncey said, are we going to address offensive line in the draft early?
I think it's a good idea, and I've said that a couple times. And if by early, I hope that means first round. There is a good offensive tackle, in particular depth in this draft, to the point where there's probably going to be one or two guys that would normally be a top 10 pick who are available at 14, which is where the Bucs are to start the first round. And if you look at a lot of mock drafts, you see a lot of that. Mm-hmm. Tristan Wirfs from Iowa being one of them. There's just Mekhi Becton, Wills, Anthony Thomas, I think it is, from Georgia.
So yeah, there's a lot of
them.
Viable options.
Austin Jackson from USC. They'll start to shake out a little bit in terms of the expected order that they'll go after the combine. But no, I think it's a really good idea.
And I feel like that's reassuring when there are that many names all at the same position that, especially even have been mocked to us, that it shows that it's not like there's one guy.
That's right. That's
the only viable one. Like if you're going to want an offensive lineman, you better hope you get him or that's it. Right. But if there are that many guys, I feel like that's a great sign.
Yeah, I would contrast that with another player that the Bucs are getting a lot in mock drafts is South Carolina defensive tackle. I guess we'd call him a defensive lineman in our defense, Javon Kinloch. Mm-hmm. And in that case, I think Auburn's Derek Brown is expected to go really high, but after that, he's clearly the next guy on everybody's board, and there's not a lot of other ones. So that one makes you'll see that in a lot of mock drafts, and that seems to me like that would be a good pick. But I also think it's less likely because you only need one team in front of us to really want an interior defensive lineman to make that not happen.
Richard is watching from California, and he asked who your favorite draft prospect is that would potentially be the best fit for the Bucs.
Well, I guess we're going to say that we could actually get, right?
Right,
Because
yeah.
if I can say anybody, I'd want Chase Young.
Right.
Or even if you're deciding to make a change of quarterback, Joe Burrow, right? So we're talking realistic.
Yeah.
I really like the idea of, I got to get this right. I keep saying it wrong. K'Lavon Chason, the LSU edge rusher. This could depend upon what happens. I mean,
Right, who all we re-sign.
yeah, even if you
everything.
get Shaq back, you still could use another one. But if you re-sign Shaq and JPP and maybe even Carl Nassib, then that's probably not a big need. But I really do like that prospect a lot. I think there's a lot of room for him to grow. He's got a lot of talent. I know he didn't have huge numbers last year, but he was really coming on at the end of the year, and I just think that's a guy that could really grow into an even better player than he is right now.
I saw that it was, I think, John and Cameron and a few different people brought up Justin Herbert. If there's a possibility that that's someone we either could get and would want to get.
Probably have to trade up for that, I would think. I keep saying if you look at mock drafts, and yes, mock drafts are just mock drafts or just somebody's guesses, but if you look at them, you'll see him usually going in top 10, maybe even top 5. If he goes before Tua, or if even there's 3 quarterbacks in the top 5, and what makes me think that will happen or something like that will happen is, and we've talked about this many times in recent years, the quarterbacks tend to rise as they get closer, right? Because teams, if you're going to make a big investment in a quarterback, you probably have to do it high in the draft, right? And so even if you're picking 10 and you're hoping a guy will fall to you, you can't take that risk,
Right.
and so you trade up. So in the end, it tends to be that the quarterbacks that are highly regarded rise. So when I see Justin Herbert going in the top 5 in most drafts, it makes me think it's definitely going to be at least that high, right?
Yeah, that's a good. They rarely fall. It has happened, but
It doesn't happen very
doesn't
often.
happen very often.
Deshaun Watson.
Yeah. Brandon is watching from D.C. and asked if there's any chance we make a run at Melvin Gordon.
Yeah, I guess. Again, I would think Melvin Gordon would command a pretty big salary, a pretty big contract for a running back, and he's had some good years in San Diego, but I don't even think he necessarily has the track record of, say, Todd Gurley when Todd Gurley got his big new deal, and obviously that one hasn't really worked out that well. If we were to sign a clearly talented running back like Melvin Gordon, I would be excited about it. I'm sure a lot of people would be too, but I just still continue to question the wisdom of big contracts for running backs because it doesn't seem like they work out as often as they should.
Matt asked, after Shaq, who is the highest priority to re-sign on defense?
Is it my decision or what the team actually thinks? Because they're keeping that
go
close
with
to
both.
the depth.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think you know the answer
I
necessarily
would think
of what the team is. So
it comes down to Ndamukong Suh versus JPP, and it might be hard if you're also getting Shaq to keep all 3. If you're asking me, since you're already going to be investing in the edge rusher and Shaq, and you could maybe even draft one in the draft, Ndamukong Suh would be the one I'd go after next. It's just the way he solidified that front, how well he worked with Vita Vea and Will Golston, how great our run defense was, how often he commanded double teams. That's not just me saying it. There's stats out there of how often he was double teamed, which helps everybody else get favorable matchups and really helped the pass rush. We ended up with, I know he only had, 2.5 sacks, something like that, I think. But the team ended up with 47 sacks, which is the second most we've ever had in a season. So I think he was a big part of that, even though it doesn't show up in the stat line. And he was obviously one of the main reasons we had the best run defense in the league and the best run defense statistically that the Bucs have ever had.
Right.
I would like to keep as much of that intact as possible.
yeah, that makes complete sense. And Daniel asked, what are your thoughts on Leonard Williams? What kind of salary would he command versus Ndamukong Suh?
Well, is he a free agent?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay. Oh, yeah, that's right. I was reading that somebody projecting that the Giants might franchise tag him because they made a pretty aggressive trade to get him, and even though he didn't necessarily light up the world for them, if you're going to trade those assets, you'd like to keep them around probably, right? Leonard Williams, I'm going to have to be honest here and say I don't really know his top strengths. I don't, is he a great run stopper? I mean, I know he's a big guy. I know he's like the third guy drafted overall, and I'm sure he's supposed to be an all-around stud in the middle there. I don't think his career has been as impactful as his two teams have been hoping it would be, right? As like the third overall pick, I think. So I'd stick with Ndamukong Suh. And I think he'll probably be cheaper because he's farther along in his career, right? So he's probably going to get shorter deals. As he's been. He played the last 2 years on 1-year deals.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, well, that's going to do it for us on this edition of Buccaneers Insider Live presented by Miller Lite. Thanks as always for watching and for all of your questions and telling us where you're watching from. We'll be back here next week to answer all the ones that hopefully we didn't get to today, so we'll see you then.